What if I told you that World War III was prevented not by diplomats or generals, but by a banned pilot who stole the most expensive aircraft in military history? This is the true story of Captain Anne Angelus, the woman they said would never fly again, who broke every rule to save humanity from nuclear annihilation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly under the scorching July sun as Captain Anne Angelus stood in the shadow of Nellis Air Force Base's most restricted hangar. Inside that concrete fortress sat the crown jewel of American military aviation, the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, worth $2.1 billion and capable of carrying nuclear payloads anywhere in the world undetected. Anne had once been cleared to fly that aircraft. Now, she wasn't even allowed inside the building. 3 months earlier, Anne Angelus had been the youngest pilot ever certified for B-2 operations. At 28, she possessed the rare combination of technical brilliance and ice-cold nerves required to operate the world's most sophisticated warplane. Her record was flawless. Top graduate from the Air Force Academy, perfect scores in advanced stealth operations, and a reputation for handling impossible missions with surgical precision. But perfect records, she'd learned, meant nothing when politics entered the equation. The scandal that destroyed her career began with what should have been a routine training mission over the Pacific. Anne had been leading a formation of 3 B-2s in a classified exercise when Chinese naval vessels suddenly appeared in disputed waters near Taiwan. The situation escalated rapidly. Chinese fighters launched, Taiwanese forces responded, and within minutes, Anne found herself at the center of an international incident that nearly triggered a shooting war. Her decision to break radio silence and establish direct communication with the Chinese pilots had diffused the crisis. Speaking fluent Mandarin, a skill she'd developed during her MIT graduate studies, Anne had negotiated a peaceful withdrawal that prevented what intelligence analysts later confirmed would have been the opening shots of World War III. She should have been celebrated as a hero. Instead, she was court-martialed. Captain Angelus, General Robert Harrison had said during her disciplinary hearing, his weathered face carved from decades of military service. Your actions, while well-intentioned, violated direct orders and compromised operational security. You exceeded your authority in communicating with hostile forces. Anne had stood at attention in the sterile military courtroom, her dress blues pristine despite the chaos surrounding her life. Sir, with respect, my communication prevented an armed conflict that would have... That's enough. Harrison's voice carried the finality of absolute authority. This tribunal finds you guilty of insubordination and unauthorized communication with foreign military forces. You are hereby stripped of your security clearance and permanently banned from flying classified aircraft. The gavel's echo had shattered more than just her military career. It had destroyed her identity. Now Anne worked in the base's meteorological office, analyzing weather patterns for missions she would never fly again. The irony wasn't lost on her. The woman who had prevented one war was now forbidden from participating in preventing the next one. Staff Sergeant Mike Chen, her supervisor in the weather office, tried to make conversation as they reviewed satellite data. Mike was a good man, but Anne could see the pity in his eyes every time he looked at her. Angelus, you've got that Pacific Storm System analysis ready for the briefing? Almost finished, Anne replied, her fingers dancing across the keyboard with mechanical precision. She was completing in hours what typically took other analysts days, her mind operating on a level that simple weather prediction couldn't fully engage. Through the office window, she watched B-2's taxi toward the runway for another classified mission. Each aircraft represented $2.1 billion in cutting-edge technology, radar-absorbing skin, computer systems more sophisticated than most space missions, and the capability to strike any target on Earth with precision and stealth. She knew every system, every procedure, every classified capability of those machines. And she was banned from ever touching one again. You know, Mike said quietly, there's talk around base about your case. Some people think you got a raw deal. Anne didn't respond. She'd heard the whispers, seen the divided reactions among her former colleagues. Some understood that she'd prevented a catastrophe. Others believed she'd betrayed military protocol. The truth, as usual, was more complicated than either side wanted to admit. Base, her computer chimed with an incoming classified weather alert. Anne's clearance had been downgraded, but she still held sufficient access for basic meteorological intelligence. What she saw on her screen made her blood freeze. A massive storm system was developing over the North Pacific, not a natural weather pattern, but something else entirely. The satellite imagery showed electromagnetic anomalies consistent with high-altitude nuclear testing, but according to all international treaties and monitoring systems, no nuclear tests were scheduled anywhere in the Pacific. Anne's fingers flew across her keyboard, cross-referencing the data with seismic monitoring stations, radiation detectors, and atmospheric sensors. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same terrifying conclusion. Someone was conducting secret nuclear weapons tests in international waters. She pulled up additional satellite feeds, her security clearance still sufficient to access historical weather data. What she discovered made her hands tremble. The electromagnetic signatures matched perfectly with classified test patterns from the 1990s Chinese nuclear weapons development. But this wasn't historical data. This was happening right now. Anne stared at her screen, understanding the implications with crystal clarity. If China was conducting secret nuclear tests in international waters, it meant they were preparing for something massive. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Tensions with Taiwan had been escalating for months, and intelligence reports suggested Chinese military buildup along their eastern coast. She reached for her secure phone to contact the intelligence division, then stopped. Her security clearance had been revoked for situations exactly like this. Who would believe the disgraced pilot who'd already been branded a loose cannon? Anne looked out the window again at the B-2s on the flight line. Somewhere in the Pacific, a crisis was developing that made her previous encounter look like a minor misunderstanding. And she was the only person on base who had both discovered it and possessed the unique combination of skills needed to address it. Her Mandarin language abilities, her knowledge of Chinese military protocols, her understanding of nuclear weapons systems, and her expertise in stealth operations. It was as if her entire career had been preparing her for this moment. But she was banned from flying, banned from accessing classified intelligence, banned from participating in the very missions that might prevent the catastrophe she could see developing. Anne Angelis closed her eyes and made a decision that would either save the world or destroy what remained of her life. The weather analysis could wait. She had a war to prevent. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Anne spent the next 3 days quietly gathering intelligence while maintaining her cover as a routine meteorologist. Her position in the weather office provided unexpected advantages. Meteorological data was the foundation of all military operations, and her access to atmospheric monitoring systems gave her a unique window into global military activities. Working late into the night when the office was empty, Anne began piecing together a terrifying puzzle. The electromagnetic signatures she detected weren't isolated incidents. Using her remaining security clearance, she accessed historical atmospheric data going back 6 months and discovered a pattern that made her stomach turn. The Chinese had been conducting systematic nuclear tests for half a year, each one more sophisticated than the last. The locations formed a precise grid across the Western Pacific, creating what could only be described as a testing matrix for multiple warhead deployment systems. This wasn't weapons maintenance or routine testing. This was preparation for large-scale nuclear warfare. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez from the Intelligence Division had been Anne's closest friend before the court-martial. They'd trained together at the academy, served together on classified missions, and Sarah had been one of the few officers who'd publicly supported Anne during her legal proceedings. Now, Sarah represented Anne's only chance of getting this intelligence to someone who could act on it. Anne found Sarah in the Officers Club during the Tuesday evening briefing social, a weekly tradition where off-duty personnel gathered to discuss non-classified topics. Sarah's expression was carefully neutral when Anne approached. Their friendship had become a liability in Sarah's career advancement. "Martinez," Anne said quietly, settling into a chair across from her former friend. "I need 5 minutes." Sarah glanced around the crowded room, clearly uncomfortable. "Anne, you know I can't." "This isn't about me," Anne interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is about something that's going to make Taiwan look like a border skirmish." Sarah's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Despite their complicated relationship, she knew Anne well enough to recognize when she was deadly serious. "Walk with me." They stepped outside onto the terrace overlooking the flight line. The Nevada sunset painted the desert in shades of orange and red, a beautiful backdrop for what might be their last normal conversation. "I've been monitoring atmospheric disturbances in the Pacific," Anne began, choosing her words carefully. "There are electromagnetic signatures consistent with nuclear testing occurring in international waters." Sarah's face remained impassive, but Anne caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "That's quite an accusation. Do you have evidence?" Anne pulled out her tablet, showing Sarah carefully selected data points that wouldn't violate her security restrictions. 6 months of systematic testing. Look at the pattern, the locations, the escalating yields. Sarah studied the information with the analytical precision that had made her one of the Air Force's top intelligence officers. After several minutes, she looked up with obvious concern. "Even if this is accurate, Anne, you don't have the clearance to access this level of intelligence anymore." "How did you—" "Meteorological data is still within my purview," Anne said carefully. "I'm not accessing classified intelligence systems. I'm analyzing weather patterns that happen to have military implications." It was technically true, though Anne knew she was walking a razor's edge between legitimate research and unauthorized intelligence gathering. Sarah understood the distinction as well. "Assuming you're right," Sarah said slowly, "what exactly are you suggesting I do with this information?" "You run it up the chain. Intelligence Division has resources I don't have access to anymore." "If I'm right, someone needs to start taking precautionary measures immediately." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching B-2's return from an evening training mission. "Anne, you have to understand the position you're putting me in. After what happened with the Taiwan incident, anything connected to you automatically becomes suspect." The words stung, but Anne forced herself to remain focused on the larger issue. "Then don't connect it to me. Take the data, run your own analysis, and reach your own conclusions." Sarah accepted the tablet data transfer, her expression troubled. "If this intelligence proves accurate, it suggests the Chinese are preparing for something significantly larger than regional conflict." "That's exactly what I'm afraid of," Anne replied. The next morning, Anne arrived at the weather office to find Staff Sergeant Chen waiting with obvious agitation. "Angelus, there's been some kind of security sweep overnight. Intelligence Division requested copies of all your meteorological analyses from the past month." Anne's pulse quickened. Either Sarah had acted on the information immediately, or Anne's investigation had triggered security protocols. Did they say why? "Negative. Just routine verification of atmospheric monitoring data." Chen's expression suggested he didn't believe his own words. "You haven't been accessing anything outside normal parameters, have you?" "Just weather patterns," Anne replied truthfully. 3 hours later, Anne received an encrypted message on her personal communication device, a breach of protocol that signaled the message's importance. The sender was listed as SM and contained only a brief text. "Your weather prediction was accurate. Storm intensifying rapidly. Meet me at Location 7 at 1400. Location 7 was code for the abandoned radar station 15 miles east of the base, a Cold War relic that had been decommissioned but never demolished. Anne and Sarah had used it as a meeting place during their academy years when they needed privacy for sensitive conversations. Anne arrived early, parking her vehicle behind a cluster of Joshua trees that concealed it from the main road. The radar station stood like a monument to paranoia, its massive dish frozen in position, eternally searching for threats that no longer approached from predictable directions. Sarah arrived precisely at 1400, her military bearing intact despite the clandestine nature of their meeting. "Your meteorological data was very interesting," she said without preamble. "Intelligence Division ran comprehensive analysis and discovered some additional atmospheric disturbances you might find relevant." She handed Anne a sealed envelope. "This information is classified, but it directly relates to your weather research. I suggest you study it carefully." Anne opened the envelope to find satellite imagery and electromagnetic analysis that confirmed her worst fears. The Chinese testing program was larger and more advanced than she'd realized. More critically, the pattern suggested deployment preparation for a first-strike nuclear capability that could neutralize American response systems before they could be activated. "Sarah," Anne said quietly, "how much time do we have?" "According to our best intelligence assessment, the testing phase is nearly complete. If the Chinese follow historical patterns for weapons deployment, we're looking at days rather than weeks." Anne studied the intelligence reports, her mind racing through tactical implications. The Chinese strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Conduct secret testing in international waters, develop overwhelming first strike capability, then present the world with a fait accompli that made resistance impossible. "What's our response?" Anne asked. Sarah's expression grew grim. "That's the problem. Traditional diplomatic channels require months of verification and international cooperation. Military response requires confirmation of hostile intent, which we don't have until they actually launch. By then, it's too late." Anne understood the impossible position. The intelligence was clear, but acting on it required either diplomatic solutions that took too long or military responses that couldn't be justified until the threat became reality. "There is one possibility," Sarah said carefully, "but it would require someone with specific qualifications and clearance levels that officially don't exist anymore." Anne met her friend's eyes and saw the question Sarah couldn't officially ask. What kind of specific qualifications? Stealth operations capability, advanced nuclear systems knowledge, and most importantly, demonstrated ability to communicate directly with Chinese military forces without triggering international incidents. The irony was inescapable. The same skills that had gotten Anne court-martialed were now the only tools that might prevent global catastrophe. "Hypothetically," Anne said carefully, "if someone possessed those qualifications, what would they need to do?" Sarah looked away toward the distant mountains. "Hypothetically, they'd need to find a way to communicate directly with Chinese command structure and convince them that their secret testing program had been discovered and that continuing would trigger immediate American response." Anne nodded slowly. It was an elegant solution with one impossible requirement: gaining access to the communication and stealth systems necessary to contact Chinese leadership without triggering the very conflict they were trying to prevent. "That would require access to very specific aircraft," Anne observed. "Yes," Sarah replied quietly, "it would." They stood in silence for several minutes, both understanding the implications of their conversation. Anne was being offered an unofficial mission that could save the world and would certainly destroy what remained of her military career if she attempted it. "Sarah," Anne said finally, "if someone were considering such a hypothetical mission, how much official support could they expect?" Sarah's smile was sad but resolute. "None whatsoever. This conversation never happened, and I've never seen you before in my life." Anne looked out across the Nevada desert, thinking about the B-2 sitting in its hangar just 15 miles away. Somewhere in the Pacific, Chinese submarines were positioning nuclear weapons that could eliminate American cities before anyone knew the war had started. "Understood," Anne said. "Thanks for the weather update." As Sarah drove away, Anne remained at the abandoned radar station, studying the classified intelligence and formulating a plan that would either prevent World War III or mark her as the greatest traitor in military history. The choice, she realized, was no choice at all. Anne spent that night in her small off-base apartment, surrounded by technical manuals she wasn't supposed to possess and satellite imagery that officially didn't exist. The classified intelligence Sarah had provided painted a picture more terrifying than her initial discovery. The Chinese weren't just testing nuclear weapons. They were perfecting a delivery system designed to eliminate America's nuclear response capability in a single coordinated strike. The strategy was called Blind Dragon according to intercepted communications. And it was devastatingly simple. Submarine-launched ballistic missiles would simultaneously target every major U.S. nuclear facility, command center, and communication hub. The attack would be coordinated with electromagnetic pulse weapons to disable electronic systems, ensuring that American forces couldn't coordinate a response even if they survived the initial assault. What made the plan particularly insidious was its use of stealth technology stolen from American defense contractors. The Chinese had developed radar-absorbing materials that would make their submarines virtually undetectable until the moment they launched. By the time American forces realized they were under attack, it would be too late to mount any meaningful defense. Anne studied the timeline estimates with growing dread. Intelligence analysts projected that Blind Dragon would be operational within 72 hours. After that, the Chinese could trigger global nuclear war at any moment, confident that American retaliation would be impossible. Her secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from an unknown sender. "Morning weather briefing canceled. Storm front moving faster than anticipated." All personnel advised to take shelter immediately. The message could have been routine meteorological communication, but Anne recognized the underlying warning. Something had accelerated the Chinese timeline. She no longer had 72 hours. She might have 72 minutes. Anne's hands moved with practiced efficiency as she gathered the equipment she would need. Her old flight suit hung in the closet like a memorial to her former life, but she pulled it on with the same precision she'd used during countless missions. The fabric felt familiar against her skin, awakening muscle memory that her court-martial couldn't erase. In a locked case beneath her bed, she kept the personal equipment that had been overlooked during her security clearance revocation. Her night vision goggles, encrypted communication devices, and most importantly, her biometric access cards that technically remained active due to bureaucratic oversight. The military security system was sophisticated, but it moved slowly, and Anne's clearances hadn't been fully purged from all systems. At 0300 hours, Anne drove toward Nellis Air Force Base through the pre-dawn darkness of the Nevada desert. Her plan was insane, impossible, and absolutely necessary. She was going to steal a B-2 Spirit bomber and fly it directly into Chinese airspace to prevent World War III. The irony wasn't lost on her. 3 months ago, she'd been court-martialed for unauthorized communication with Chinese forces. Now she was planning unauthorized entry into Chinese territory using stolen military aircraft. If her previous actions had been career-ending, these would be life-ending. But the alternative was the death of civilization itself. Security at Nellis was always tight, but the early morning shift change created a brief window of vulnerability that Anne had identified during her months of forced ground duty. She knew the patrol schedules, the camera blind spots, and most critically, which access points still recognized her biometric data. The service entrance near Hangar 7 was monitored by a single guard who typically made his rounds every 30 minutes. Anne waited in the shadows until Staff Sergeant Robert Wilson began his 0315 patrol, then slipped through the security checkpoint using her still-active thumbprint scanner. The hangar housing the B-2 Spirit was a cathedral of military technology. The bomber sat in the center of the space like a sleeping predator, its angular stealth profile designed to be invisible to radar while carrying enough nuclear firepower to obliterate entire nations. At $2.1 billion per aircraft, it represented the pinnacle of American military engineering. Anne had spent hundreds of hours in B-2 cockpits during her active duty, but approaching one now felt like greeting an old friend who'd been told she was dead. The aircraft's systems were more familiar to her than her own apartment. Every switch, every display, every emergency procedure burned into her memory through endless training. Technical Sergeant Maria Rodriguez was performing routine maintenance checks when Anne appeared beside the aircraft. Maria had been part of Anne's ground crew for 2 years before the court-martial, and her expression showed both surprise and something approaching relief. "Captain Angelus," Maria said quietly, using Anne's former rank out of habit. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Emergency maintenance inspection," Anne replied, hoping her voice conveyed more authority than she felt. "Intelligence Division requested immediate verification of communication systems." It was a calculated lie based on Maria's limited access to classified information. The technical sergeant wouldn't know whether such an inspection had been authorized, and Anne was counting on their previous working relationship to prevent immediate challenges to her presence. Maria's expression showed uncertainty. "Ma'am, I haven't received any notification of scheduled inspections." Anne moved closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Maria, you know I can't discuss classified operations, but this involves the highest levels of national security. I need this aircraft ready for immediate deployment." The sergeant's face showed the internal conflict between following procedure and trusting someone she'd worked with for years. Anne could see Maria weighing the risks of questioning a former superior officer against the consequences of enabling unauthorized access. "How immediate?" Maria asked finally. "Within the hour." Maria nodded slowly, making a decision that would either save her career or destroy it. "All systems are operational. Fuel tanks are topped off, and the stealth coating was refreshed yesterday. She's ready to fly." Anne felt a surge of gratitude mixed with guilt. Maria was trusting her based on their professional relationship, unaware that she was enabling what amounted to theft of military property. "Thank you, Sergeant. Your professionalism is noted and appreciated." As Maria gathered her equipment and departed, Anne began her pre-flight checklist with mechanical precision. Every system responded perfectly: hydraulics, electronics, engines, navigation, communication arrays. The B-2 was a masterpiece of engineering, and it was about to become the instrument of either salvation or treason. The most challenging aspect of her plan wasn't stealing the aircraft. It was programming the flight computers for a mission that officially didn't exist. Anne needed to reach Chinese airspace without triggering defensive systems, establish communication with military leadership, and convince them to abandon Blind Dragon before American intelligence discovered the theft and branded her a defector. She had perhaps 6 hours before her absence would be noticed, and another 2 before the stolen B-2 would be tracked and intercepted. 8 hours to prevent global nuclear war, using stolen military equipment and the communication skills that had already destroyed her career once. Anne strapped herself into the pilot's seat and began the engine startup sequence. The B-2's 4 turbofan engines came online with a whisper-quiet efficiency that made the aircraft seem almost alive. This was what she'd been born to do, not analyzing weather patterns in a forgotten office, but piloting the most advanced aircraft ever built on missions that would determine the fate of nations. The hangar doors opened with hydraulic precision, revealing the pre-dawn sky above Nevada. In a few hours, that sky would be filled with American fighters scrambling to intercept her. Chinese radar systems would track her approach, and nuclear submarines would prepare to launch the weapons that would end civilization. But for this moment, Anne Angelus was exactly where she belonged, in the cockpit of a stealth bomber, preparing to fly into the heart of enemy territory to prevent a war that would kill billions. She advanced the throttles and taxied toward the runway, knowing that her next radio transmission would brand her as either the greatest hero or the most dangerous traitor in American history. The choice had been made. There was no turning back now. As the B-2 lifted off into the Nevada dawn, Anne set course for the Western Pacific and the most important mission of her life, a mission that officially didn't exist, authorized by no one, with the stakes being nothing less than the survival of human civilization. Behind her, Nellis Air Force Base continued its routine operations, unaware that their most restricted aircraft was now flying toward what would either be the prevention of World War III or the beginning of it. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly below as Anne's stolen B-2 Spirit sliced through the stratosphere at 50,000 feet, its stealth technology rendering it invisible to conventional radar systems. She had been airborne for 3 hours, flying westward toward a confrontation that would either prevent global catastrophe or trigger it. Her communication systems crackled with increasingly frantic transmissions from Nellis Air Force Base. The theft had been discovered faster than she'd anticipated. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez had apparently reported the unauthorized takeoff within minutes of Anne's departure, either out of conscience or fear for her own career. Any aircraft, this is Nellis Control. Stolen military aircraft, call sign unknown, respond immediately. You are ordered to return to base and land immediately. Anne maintained radio silence, but she monitored the expanding search operation with professional interest. Every few minutes, new voices joined the hunt. Fighter squadrons scrambling from bases across the western United States, AWACS surveillance aircraft, even civilian air traffic controllers being briefed on the unprecedented security breach. Control, this is Viper Squadron. We have negative contact on stolen aircraft. Request expanded search parameters. Viper Squadron, be advised that aircraft is B-2 Spirit with full stealth capability. Visual identification may be your only option. Anne allowed herself a grim smile. They were searching for her using conventional methods, but the B-2's radar cross-section was smaller than a sparrow. Unless a pilot looked directly at her aircraft from close range, she would remain invisible until she chose to reveal herself. Her navigation system showed her position as roughly 800 miles west of California, flying toward coordinates that intelligence reports had identified as the center of Chinese naval operations. According to Sarah's classified briefings, Chinese submarines were positioned in a defensive grid approximately 1,200 miles east of mainland China, ready to launch the Blind Dragon strike at any moment. The most challenging aspect of her mission wasn't reaching Chinese airspace. It was establishing communication with military leadership without being shot down in the process. Anne needed to convince commanders who viewed her as an enemy pilot that she was actually trying to prevent the war they were preparing to start. Her Mandarin language skills would be crucial, but they might not be enough. Chinese air defense systems were sophisticated and trigger-happy, especially regarding unidentified aircraft approaching their territorial waters. Anne would need to time her revelation perfectly, close enough to be taken seriously, but far enough to avoid immediate destruction. At 1,200 miles from the California coast, Anne's passive sensors detected the first signs of Chinese military activity. Electronic signatures consistent with submarine communication systems appeared on her displays, confirming intelligence estimates about Blind Dragon positioning. The submarines were exactly where American analysts had predicted, arrayed in a pattern that would allow simultaneous strikes against every major U.S. target. Anne activated her secure communication systems and began transmitting on frequencies known to be monitored by Chinese intelligence services. She spoke slowly and clearly in Mandarin, hoping her message would reach someone with authority to understand its implications. Chinese Naval Command, this is Captain Anne Angelis of the United States Air Force. I am approaching your territorial waters in an unarmed stealth aircraft to discuss a matter of critical importance to both our nations. I request immediate communication with senior military leadership regarding Operation Blind Dragon. The response was immediate and hostile. Unknown aircraft, you have violated Chinese territorial waters. You are ordered to reverse course immediately or face defensive action. Anne continued her approach, maintaining steady course and speed. Chinese Naval Command. I am the pilot who prevented military conflict over Taiwan 3 months ago through direct communication with your forces. I am attempting to prevent a much larger conflict now. Operation Blind Dragon has been detected by American intelligence. I need to speak with someone who can authorize its cancellation. Silence filled the radio frequencies for several long minutes. Anne could imagine the frantic conversations taking place in Chinese command centers as officers tried to verify her identity and determine whether her knowledge of Blind Dragon represented an intelligence breach or an opportunity for negotiation. Her radar warning systems suddenly illuminated with multiple threats. Chinese fighters were scrambling from naval bases, their modern J-20 stealth fighters racing to intercept her aircraft. Unlike the older aircraft she'd encountered over Taiwan, these were peer competitors to American technology, capable of detecting and engaging even B-2 stealth bombers under the right conditions. Captain Angelis, came a new voice over the radio, speaking accented but fluent English. This is Admiral Chen Wei of the People's Liberation Army Navy. You claim knowledge of classified operations. Prove your identity and explain your presence in our territorial waters. Anne felt a surge of hope mixed with fear. Admiral Chen Wei was a name she recognized from intelligence briefings, a moderate voice within Chinese military leadership who had argued against aggressive confrontation with American forces. If anyone could authorize the cancellation of Blind Dragon, it would be Chen. Admiral Chen, 3 months ago I was the pilot who established direct communication with your forces near Taiwan when American and Chinese aircraft were on collision course. I spoke with Colonel Liu Zheng and convinced him to withdraw his fighters to prevent shooting war. My actions were unauthorized by American command and resulted in my court-martial and removal from active duty. Another pause, longer this time. Anne could picture Chen consulting intelligence files, verifying details of the Taiwan incident that had ended her career. Captain Angelis, our records confirm your identity and your role in preventing conflict over Taiwan. However, your current presence represents a significant escalation. You have stolen military aircraft and violated our sovereignty. Admiral, I violated sovereignty to prevent the deaths of millions. American intelligence has detected Operation Blind Dragon. Your submarine positions, your nuclear testing, your timeline for implementation. Everything has been discovered. If you proceed with the operation, you will trigger immediate American nuclear response. Anne's threat display showed Chinese fighters approaching from multiple directions. Her stealth technology provided some protection, but she was now operating within the envelope of Chinese radar systems specifically designed to detect low observable aircraft. Captain Angelis, Admiral Chen's voice carried a note of carefully controlled tension. Assuming your intelligence is accurate, what exactly are you proposing? I'm proposing that you contact American military leadership directly and establish communication protocols that will allow both sides to step back from nuclear confrontation. My government knows about Blind Dragon, but they don't know I'm here. If you call them now and propose diplomatic resolution, you can present it as Chinese initiative, rather than response to American pressure. It was a carefully calculated offer. Anne was giving Chen the opportunity to save face while abandoning the operation, presenting surrender as diplomatic leadership rather than military defeat. And what assurance do I have that this is not elaborate American deception designed to expose our operations? Anne checked her fuel levels and calculated distance to Chinese mainland. She was committed now, too far from American territory to return even if she wanted to. Admiral, I am currently flying a stolen B-2 bomber that my own government considers a rogue aircraft. American fighters are searching for me with orders to force me down. If this were an official operation, I would hardly be branded a criminal by my own military. Her radar warning system suddenly screamed with missile lock indicators. Chinese surface-to-air missiles were tracking her aircraft, and fighter planes were closing to visual range. Anne was seconds away from becoming the first American pilot shot down in Chinese airspace since the Cold War. Admiral Chen, she said urgently, I need your answer now. Will you contact American leadership to prevent nuclear war, or will you shoot me down and proceed with an operation that will end civilization? The missile lock indicators held steady for 10 eternal seconds. Anne's finger hovered over her ejection controls, knowing that survival of her mission was more important than survival of her aircraft. Finally, Admiral Chen's voice returned to the radio. Captain Angeles, maintain current heading and altitude. You are cleared to land at Wuhan Air Base for diplomatic consultation. Any deviation from assigned course will result in immediate engagement. Anne felt her body sag with relief as the missile warnings ceased. She had crossed the line from theft to defection, from rogue pilot to diplomatic negotiator. There would be no going home after this. Her career, her life, her identity as an American officer were all sacrificed in the hope of preventing global catastrophe. Admiral Chen acknowledged. Request permission to establish direct communication link between Chinese command and American strategic forces. Permission granted, Captain. Let us see if we can prevent this war together. As Anne banked toward Wuhan Air Base, she realized that the most dangerous part of her mission was just beginning. She had successfully stolen a B-2 bomber and flown it into Chinese airspace without being shot down. Now she had to convince two nuclear superpowers to trust each other enough to step back from mutual annihilation. The stakes had never been higher, and failure was not an option. Wuhan Air Base materialized through the morning haze as Anne approached Chinese airspace, her stolen B-2 escorted by 6 J-20 stealth fighters in a formation that was equal parts honor guard and prison escort. The irony wasn't lost on her. The most advanced American stealth bomber was about to land on Chinese soil, piloted by a court-martialed officer who was either about to prevent World War III or trigger it. The runway at Wuhan stretched before her like a concrete lifeline, surrounded by military installations that represented decades of Chinese military advancement. Anti-aircraft batteries tracked her approach with mechanical precision, while ground crews prepared for the arrival of the most sensitive piece of American military technology ever to fall into foreign hands. Captain Angeles, Admiral Chen's voice crackled through her headphones. You are cleared for immediate landing. Remain in your aircraft upon touchdown. Ground personnel will guide you to a secure hangar. Anne executed a flawless landing, the B-2's landing gear touching down with barely a whisper on the Chinese runway. As she taxied toward the designated hangar, she could see hundreds of military personnel lining the taxiway, pilots, technicians, intelligence officers, and senior commanders who had come to witness this unprecedented moment in military history. The hangar doors closed behind her with hydraulic finality, sealing the B-2 and its pilot inside Chinese custody. Anne shut down the engines and completed her post-flight checklist with methodical precision, knowing that these might be the last routine procedures she would ever perform as a pilot. When she finally opened the cockpit canopy, Admiral Chen Wei stood waiting beside a contingent of Chinese military officers. Chen was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 50, with silver threading through black hair and eyes that suggested both intelligence and caution. He wore the uniform of the People's Liberation Army Navy, with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected millions of lives. Captain Angeles, Chen said in English as Anne climbed down from the aircraft, welcome to Chinese territory. I hope your journey was productive. Anne straightened into military bearing despite her uncertain status. Admiral Chen, thank you for authorizing my landing. I believe we have very little time to prevent a catastrophe. Chen gestured toward a waiting vehicle. Indeed. We have much to discuss, and the situation is evolving rapidly. Your government has discovered your aircraft missing and is taking measures we must address immediately. As they drove toward the base command center, Anne could see the controlled chaos of a military organization responding to crisis. Communications personnel ran between buildings carrying encrypted messages, while senior officers gathered in urgent conferences. The atmosphere was electric, with the tension of a force preparing for either war or peace, uncertain which would come first. The command center was a monument to modern military technology. Wall-mounted displays showing global satellite feeds, communications systems linking every Chinese military unit worldwide, and most ominously, status boards tracking the positions of nuclear submarines that formed the backbone of Operation Blind Dragon. Captain Angelus, Chen said, indicating a chair at the central briefing table. Before we proceed, I must inform you that your government has issued statements regarding your status. You are officially listed as a rogue pilot who has stolen classified military equipment. They are demanding immediate return of both you and the aircraft. Anne had expected this development, but hearing it confirmed still sent a chill through her chest. Admiral, what exactly did they say? Chen activated a wall display showing American news broadcasts. Anne watched in surreal fascination as her own photograph appeared on screen next to footage of B-2 bombers and headlines declaring, "Rogue pilot steals nuclear bomber." The news anchor's voice filled the command center. Captain Anne Angelus, previously court-martialed for unauthorized communication with Chinese forces, has stolen a B-2 Spirit stealth bomber worth over $2 billion. Military sources confirm the aircraft is equipped with classified technology and represents a significant security breach. Anne closed her eyes as the full implications hit her. Her government wasn't just disavowing her actions. They were branding her as a traitor to prevent any suggestion that her mission had official sanction. It was politically necessary but personally devastating. As you can see, Chen continued, your position is complicated. However, your warnings about Operation Blind Dragon require serious consideration. Chen activated another display showing satellite imagery of Chinese submarine positions in the Western Pacific. Your intelligence regarding our naval deployments is remarkably accurate. This suggests either sophisticated American surveillance capabilities or information provided by sources within our command structure. Anne studied the display, recognizing the tactical formations from Sarah's briefing materials. Admiral, American intelligence has been tracking your submarines for months. They know about the nuclear testing, the deployment patterns, and the strategic objectives. What they don't know is the exact timeline for implementation. And what is your assessment of that timeline? Anne met Chen's eyes directly. According to American intelligence estimates, Operation Blind Dragon will be operational within hours, not days. Your window for diplomatic resolution is closing rapidly. Chen exchanged glances with his staff officers, their expressions confirming Anne's assessment. Captain Angelus, you present us with a significant dilemma. Your information suggests that proceeding with our current operations will trigger immediate American response. However, canceling those operations based on warnings from a rogue American pilot carries its own risks. Before Anne could respond, an aide approached Chen with an urgent message. The admiral read it quickly, his expression growing grim. Captain, I'm afraid the situation has just become more complicated. Your president has contacted our leadership directly. He is demanding immediate return of both you and the stolen aircraft, and he has made certain threats regarding consequences if his demands are not met. Anne felt the walls closing in around her mission. What kind of threats? Economic sanctions, military exercises in the Taiwan Strait, and suspension of all diplomatic communications until you are returned, Chen paused. However, he has also indicated willingness to discuss broader strategic issues if resolution can be achieved quickly. Anne recognized the opening immediately. Admiral, that's your opportunity. The President is offering to negotiate broader issues. That's diplomatic language for discussing Operation Blind Dragon without admitting American knowledge of it. Chen was quiet for a moment, studying displays that showed real-time positions of American and Chinese military forces across the Pacific. Captain Angelus, I want you to understand the magnitude of what you're proposing. You're asking us to abandon a strategic operation that represents years of planning and enormous resource investment, based on warnings from a pilot who is officially considered a criminal by her own government. I'm asking you to choose between starting a nuclear war and preventing one, Anne replied quietly. Everything else is just politics. The command center fell silent, except for the hum of electronic equipment and the distant sounds of military operations continuing outside. Anne could see Chen weighing impossible choices: trust a rogue American pilot, or proceed with an operation that might trigger global catastrophe. Admiral, Anne continued, I have a proposal that might satisfy both sides. Contact the American president directly and propose immediate summit discussions regarding Pacific security arrangements. Present it as Chinese initiative to reduce tensions. Don't mention Blind Dragon specifically, but offer to discuss submarine deployments and nuclear testing protocols. Chen's eyes showed interest. And what would you expect America to offer in return? Reduction of military exercises near Taiwan, suspension of new weapons deployments in the region, and establishment of direct military communication protocols to prevent future incidents. Anne paused. And they'd probably agree to treat my case as internal military discipline rather than international incident. It was a carefully crafted proposal that offered face-saving measures for both sides, while addressing the underlying strategic issues that had created the crisis. Chen could present it to Chinese leadership as diplomatic initiative rather than surrender to American pressure. Captain Angeles, Chen said finally, your proposal has merit, however, implementing it requires trust between our governments that currently does not exist. Anne straightened in her chair. Admiral, that's where I can help. I'm the only person in this room who has direct experience communicating with both Chinese and American military leadership during crisis situations. Let me establish the initial contact and facilitate the diplomatic process. Chen studied her with the calculating gaze of an experienced strategist. You're proposing to serve as unofficial mediator between our governments? I'm proposing to serve as whatever it takes to prevent nuclear war. The Admiral was quiet for several minutes, consulting with his staff in rapid Mandarin. Anne caught fragments of the conversation, references to strategic implications, political risks, and time constraints that were becoming more critical by the hour. Finally, Chen turned back to Anne with a decision that would determine the fate of millions. Captain Angeles, I am willing to attempt your proposed solution. However, success will require immediate action and absolute precision. Any mistake could trigger the very conflict we're trying to prevent. Anne nodded grimly. Understood, Admiral. When do we begin? Chen checked his watch and activated communication systems that would link the command center directly to both Chinese leadership in Beijing and American Strategic Command. We begin now, Captain. The next few hours will determine whether you're remembered as the pilot who prevented World War III or the one who started it. As Anne prepared to facilitate the most important diplomatic communication of her life, she realized that stealing a B-2 bomber had been the easy part of her mission. Now she had to convince two nuclear superpowers to trust each other enough to step back from mutual annihilation. The stakes had never been higher, and failure would mean the end of civilization itself. The secure communication chamber at Wuhan Air Base hummed with tension, as technicians established encrypted connections between Chinese command, the Pentagon, and the White House. Anne found herself at the center of the most critical diplomatic moment in modern history, serving as translator and mediator between two nuclear superpowers on the brink of war. Admiral Chen sat across from her at the communication console, his expression grave as status updates flowed in from Chinese submarines positioned throughout the Pacific. Operation Blind Dragon remained active, nuclear weapons armed and ready for launch, while American strategic forces had been elevated to DEFCON 2, the highest alert level short of imminent nuclear war. Captain Angeles, Chen said quietly, before we begin, you should know that Chinese leadership has authorized me to proceed with Blind Dragon if these negotiations fail. The window for diplomatic resolution is measured in minutes, not hours. Anne felt the weight of civilization pressing down on her shoulders. Admiral, help me understand the Chinese position. What would it take for your government to stand down the operation? Chen activated a secure display showing Chinese strategic assessments. Our intelligence indicates that American forces are preparing preemptive strikes against our submarine fleet. From our perspective, Blind Dragon represents defensive action against imminent American aggression. Anne studied the intelligence reports with growing alarm. American naval movements in the Pacific did indeed suggest preparation for anti-submarine warfare operations. Both sides were interpreting the other's defensive measures as offensive preparations. creating a spiral toward mutual destruction. Admiral, this is exactly the kind of misunderstanding that leads to accidental wars. American forces are responding to what they perceive as Chinese nuclear threat, while Chinese forces are responding to what they perceive as American attack preparation. Before China could respond, the secure communication system activated with an incoming transmission from Washington. President Michael Harrison's voice filled the chamber with barely controlled authority. "This is President Harrison. I'm told there's a rogue American pilot in Chinese custody who claims to have information about imminent threats to U.S. security." Admiral Chen activated his microphone. "Mr. President, this is Admiral Chen Wei of the People's Liberation Army Navy. Captain Angeles has provided intelligence regarding military operations that could lead to significant escalation between our nations." "Admiral Chen, I want that pilot and that aircraft returned immediately. Captain Angeles is a court-martialed officer who has stolen classified military equipment. Any information she's provided is unauthorized and unreliable." Anne leaned forward toward the microphone, knowing that her next words would either open diplomatic dialogue or close it forever. "Mr. President, this is Captain Anne Angeles. Sir, I'm speaking to you from Chinese territory because American and Chinese forces are approximately 6 hours away from nuclear exchange." Silence filled the communication channel for several seconds. When President Harrison spoke again, his tone had shifted from authority to urgent concern. "Captain Angeles, explain your assessment immediately." "Sir, Chinese naval forces have detected American submarine movements that they interpret as preparation for preemptive strikes. In response, they have activated Operation Blind Dragon, a nuclear first strike capability designed to eliminate American strategic response before it can be deployed." "Captain, you're discussing classified information over open channels with foreign military personnel." Anne met Admiral Chen's eyes across the table. "Mr. President, classification levels are irrelevant when discussing information that could prevent nuclear war. Admiral Chen, would you brief the President on current Chinese submarine positions?" Chen activated tactical displays that were simultaneously transmitted to Washington. "Mr. President, Chinese naval forces are currently positioned at coordinates that your intelligence services have been monitoring for several months. However, you may not be aware that these submarines have been authorized to launch nuclear weapons in response to any American attack against Chinese naval assets." President Harrison's voice carried new urgency. "Admiral Chen, American forces are not preparing preemptive strikes. Our submarine movements are standard patrol operations in international waters." "Mr. President," Chen replied, "our intelligence assessments suggest otherwise. American attack submarines have been tracking our vessels for weeks, and your recent naval exercises have practiced exactly the kind of coordinated anti-submarine operations that would be required for preemptive strikes." Anne could hear the classic elements of strategic miscalculation developing in real time. Each side was interpreting defensive measures as offensive preparations, creating justification for their own escalatory responses. "Gentlemen," Anne interrupted, "this is exactly what happened over Taiwan 3 months ago. Both sides making reasonable preparations that the other side interprets as aggressive threats. We need to establish protocols that prevent these misunderstandings." President Harrison's voice carried a note of grudging respect. "Captain Angeles, you may be a rogue pilot, but your analysis is sound." "Admiral Chen, what would be required for Chinese forces to stand down their current operations?" Chen consulted with his staff in rapid Mandarin before responding. "Mr. President, Chinese leadership would require 3 commitments. First, immediate cessation of American submarine tracking operations against Chinese naval assets. Second, establishment of direct military communication protocols to prevent future misunderstandings. And third, formal agreement to limit naval exercises in disputed Pacific waters. And in return, China would suspend current submarine operations, cancel planned nuclear testing, and establish transparency protocols for future naval deployments in international waters." Anne felt a surge of hope as she heard the framework for agreement taking shape. Both sides were offering to step back from confrontation while maintaining face through the language of mutual concessions rather than unilateral surrender. "Mr. President," Anne said, "this represents exactly the kind of diplomatic breakthrough that can prevent nuclear conflict. Both sides get security guarantees while avoiding the appearance of capitulation to pressure." President Harrison was quiet for several minutes, presumably consulting with his National Security Council. When he returned to the channel, his voice carried the weight of a decision that would affect global history. Admiral Chen, the United States is prepared to accept your proposal with one modification. Rather than limiting naval exercises, we propose establishing joint observation protocols that allow both nations to monitor each other's military activities in disputed areas. Chen's expression showed cautious optimism. Mr. President, joint observation represents significant advancement over current tension levels. Chinese leadership could support such arrangements. Anne realized they were witnessing the prevention of nuclear war through careful diplomatic language that allowed both sides to claim victory. China could present the agreement as successful negotiation from position of strength, while America could present it as prevention of Chinese aggression through firm diplomacy. There is one remaining issue, President Harrison continued, the status of Captain Angeles and the stolen aircraft. Admiral Chen looked at Anne with something approaching respect. Mr. President, Captain Angeles has demonstrated exceptional service to both our nations by facilitating this diplomatic breakthrough. China would support treating her case as internal American military discipline rather than international incident. Anne felt her throat tighten with emotion. Chen was offering her a path home, though she knew her military career was over, regardless of how her case was handled. Admiral Chen, I appreciate your recommendation, President Harrison said. Captain Angeles will face appropriate military justice, but her actions today will be considered in mitigation of her unauthorized activities. The secure communication system suddenly erupted with urgent transmissions from Chinese submarine commanders requesting confirmation of their operational status. Admiral Chen responded in rapid Mandarin, authorizing immediate stand-down of Blind Dragon operations. Simultaneously, Anne could hear President Harrison issuing orders to American strategic forces. All units, this is the President, stand down from DEFCON 2. Implement immediate protocols for joint observation arrangements with Chinese naval forces. As the command center buzzed with activity implementing the ceasefire protocols, Anne realized that her impossible mission had succeeded. She had stolen a $2.1 billion stealth bomber, flown it into enemy territory, and facilitated diplomatic negotiations that prevented global nuclear war. Captain Angeles, Admiral Chen said quietly, your aircraft will be returned to American custody along with yourself. However, you should know that your actions today saved millions of lives. Anne looked around the Chinese command center, where she had spent the most important hours of her life. Admiral, serving as a bridge between our nations has been the greatest honor of my career. As preparations began for her return to American custody, Anne Angeles reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. Court-martialed for preventing one war, she had stolen military aircraft to prevent another. Her career was over, but civilization would continue. Sometimes, she realized, the greatest victory was simply ensuring that tomorrow would come. The nuclear weapons were standing down, the submarines were returning to port, and the world would wake up to another day of peace that they would never know they had almost lost. It was enough. The journey home began 12 hours after the nuclear crisis ended, with Anne once again in the cockpit of the stolen B-2 Spirit. This time, however, she wasn't alone. Major David Park, a veteran Air Force pilot specially selected for his diplomatic experience, occupied the instructor pilot seat as both escort and guardian for her return to American territory. Chinese ground crews had treated the B-2 with professional respect during its brief stay at Wuhan Air Base, conducting thorough but non-intrusive inspections that avoided compromising classified systems. Admiral Chen had personally ensured that American military technology remained secure, a gesture of goodwill that reinforced the fragile trust established during the crisis negotiations. Captain Angeles, Major Park said as they completed pre-flight procedures, I want you to understand the situation waiting for you back home. The media coverage has been intense, and public opinion is complicated. Anne focused on her instrument checks, trying to maintain emotional distance from the reality she would soon face. What exactly are they saying, Major? Park activated a communication tablet showing American news broadcasts from the past 24 hours. Anne watched with fascination and horror as her own story unfolded through the lens of media interpretation. Breaking news. Rogue pilot Captain Anne Angeles, who stole a B-2 bomber yesterday, has successfully facilitated emergency diplomatic negotiations between the United States and China, preventing what intelligence sources describe as imminent nuclear conflict. The news anchor continued. However, military legal experts emphasize that her unauthorized actions constitute serious crimes regardless of their outcome. Captain Angeles faces charges of theft of military property, desertion, and violation of classified protocols. Anne felt a hollow sensation in her chest. Even success carried the price of complete professional destruction. "There's more," Park said quietly, switching to a different news channel. "The Chinese government has released statements praising your role in preventing conflict, which is creating political complications for the administration." The Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman appeared on screen. "Captain Angeles demonstrated exceptional courage and diplomatic skill in facilitating communication between our nations during a critical moment. China recognizes her contribution to international peace and stability." Anne realized the impossible position her actions had created for American leadership. Punishing her too severely would suggest ingratitude for preventing nuclear war, while treating her too leniently would encourage other military personnel to ignore orders whenever they disagreed with policy. "Major Park," Anne said, "what's the unofficial word from Pentagon leadership?" Park was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Unofficially, there's recognition that your actions prevented catastrophic conflict. However, officially, the military cannot appear to endorse unauthorized operations regardless of their outcome." The B-2 climbed steadily through the stratosphere as they departed Chinese airspace, beginning the long journey across the Pacific toward whatever future awaited Anne in America. Below them, Chinese and American naval forces were implementing the joint observation protocols negotiated during the crisis, turning potential battlegrounds into cooperation zones. As they reached cruising altitude, Anne's communication systems activated with an encrypted message from an unexpected source. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez was requesting direct communication, using emergency channels that bypassed normal command structure. "Anne," Sarah's voice carried relief mixed with concern, "thank God you're safe. I've been monitoring the situation from Intelligence Division, and I need to brief you on what's happening back home." "Sarah, I assume my security clearance issues have gotten significantly worse." "Actually, that's complicated. Your actions revealed intelligence capabilities that suggest Chinese penetration of our classified systems was more extensive than previously realized. The security review is focusing on systemic failures rather than individual breaches." Anne felt a spark of hope. If her case became part of a larger investigation into security vulnerabilities, it might be handled differently than simple criminal prosecution. "There's something else," Sarah continued. "Your weather analysis that first detected the Chinese nuclear testing has been validated by independent sources. You identified a strategic threat weeks before it appeared on official intelligence assessments." Major Park glanced at Anne with new respect. "Captain, you detected Operation Blind Dragon through meteorological analysis?" "Electromagnetic signatures from nuclear testing create atmospheric disturbances," Anne explained. "I was monitoring weather patterns and noticed anomalies consistent with high-altitude nuclear detonations." "That's remarkable," Park said. "How long were you tracking the threat before you decided to act?" Anne thought back to that moment in the weather office, when she'd first seen the satellite data that would change everything. 3 weeks of confirmed evidence, but I'd been seeing suspicious patterns for almost 2 months. Sarah's voice returned through the communication system. "Anne, that timeline is crucial for your legal defense. You identified a threat, reported it through proper channels, and only took unauthorized action when conventional response proved inadequate. It was a lifeline Anne hadn't dared to hope for. Her actions could be presented as emergency response to imminent threat, rather than rogue operation motivated by personal grievance." "Sarah, what about Admiral Chen's recommendation regarding my case?" "Chinese diplomatic pressure is significant. Their government has formally requested that your case be handled as internal military discipline rather than international incident. That carries weight with State Department officials who want to maintain the cooperation agreements you helped establish." As they crossed the international date line, Anne found herself in the surreal position of flying toward her own court-martial while being simultaneously praised by foreign governments and credited with preventing global catastrophe. The contradictions of her situation reflected the complexity of modern military operations, where individual initiative could simultaneously violate orders and serve national interests. Major Park activated long-range communication systems as they approached the halfway point of their journey. Captain Angelus, I've been authorized to inform you that General Patricia Webb has been assigned as reviewing officer for your case. Anne's pulse quickened. General Webb was known throughout the Air Force as a fair but demanding officer who had risen through the ranks during an era when female pilots faced significant institutional barriers. If anyone would understand the impossible choices Anne had faced, it would be Webb. Major, what can you tell me about the charges I'm facing? Park consulted classified documents he'd been provided for the return journey: theft of military property, unauthorized operation of classified aircraft, violation of international airspace, and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. However, there are also recommendations for commendation for extraordinary service in preventing international conflict. The contradiction was stark, facing serious criminal charges while being recommended for medals. Anne realized that her case would likely set precedents for how the military handled future situations where individual initiative conflicted with institutional protocol. There's one more thing you should know, Park continued. The Joint Chiefs have requested a classified briefing on your assessment of Chinese nuclear capabilities observed during your mission. Your intelligence gathering will contribute to national security policy for years to come. Anne looked out at the endless Pacific below, thinking about the submarines that had been positioned for nuclear war just days earlier. Her unauthorized mission had not only prevented conflict, but had also provided intelligence insights that would help prevent future crises. As they began their descent toward Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii for refueling, Anne prepared herself for the transition from diplomatic hero back to military defendant. The next phase of her journey would take place in courtrooms and hearing chambers rather than cockpits and command centers. Major Park, she said quietly, whatever happens next, I want you to know that I'd make the same choice again. Some things are worth the consequences. Park nodded with obvious respect. Captain, I think you'll find that sentiment is shared by more people than you might expect. The Hawaiian Islands appeared on the horizon, marking the end of Anne's journey as an international diplomatic mediator and the beginning of her return to American military justice. She had prevented World War III, but now she had to face the peacetime consequences of her wartime decisions. The most challenging part of her mission was about to begin, proving that sometimes breaking the rules was the only way to serve them. As the B-2 touched down on American soil for the first time since her unauthorized departure, Anne Angelus prepared to discover whether her country would treat her as a hero or a criminal. The answer, she suspected, would be both. 6 weeks after preventing World War III, Captain Anne Angelus stood at attention in the military courtroom at Offutt Air Force Base, facing a panel of officers who would determine whether she was a hero or a criminal. The proceedings had drawn international attention, with diplomatic observers from 12 nations present to witness how America would handle the case of the pilot who had saved civilization through unauthorized action. General Patricia Webb presided over the tribunal with the measured authority of someone who understood that this case would establish precedents for military conduct in the modern era. The charges against Anne remained serious: theft of military property, unauthorized operation of classified aircraft, and violation of international protocols. But the circumstances surrounding those charges had created unprecedented legal complexity. Captain Angelus, General Webb began, this tribunal has reviewed extensive evidence regarding your actions during the period of July 15th through 17th. Before we proceed to findings, do you wish to make a statement regarding your conduct? Anne had spent weeks preparing for this moment with military lawyers who seemed equally puzzled by her case. Her defense attorney, Colonel James Mitchell, had advised her to emphasize the emergency nature of her actions and the intelligence she had gathered through legitimate means. But Anne had decided to speak from the heart rather than from legal strategy. General Webb, members of the tribunal, Anne began, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. I stand before you today as someone who violated military regulations to serve military objectives. 6 weeks ago, I discovered intelligence indicating imminent nuclear conflict between the United States and China. I reported this intelligence through proper channels, but the timeline for diplomatic resolution was inadequate to prevent catastrophe. She paused, meeting the eyes of each panel member. I made a choice to act on my oath as an officer to defend the Constitution and protect American lives, even though that action required violating specific military protocols. I do not apologize for preventing nuclear war, but I accept responsibility for the unauthorized methods I used to achieve that objective." General Webb nodded thoughtfully. "Captain Angeles, the tribunal recognizes the extraordinary circumstances surrounding your actions. However, we must also consider the implications of military personnel taking unauthorized action based on their individual assessment of strategic situations." The prosecutor, Colonel Elizabeth Santos, rose to present the military's case. "General Webb, while we acknowledge the positive outcome of Captain Angeles' actions, we cannot ignore the fact that she stole classified military equipment worth over $2 billion and violated the sovereignty of a foreign nation. Regardless of her motivations, these actions represent serious breaches of military discipline that cannot be excused by their results." Colonel Santos activated a display showing the timeline of Anne's actions. The defendant bypassed her chain of command, ignored direct orders, and took matters into her own hands based on intelligence analysis that was outside her authorized scope of responsibility. If we excuse these violations, we establish a precedent that any officer can violate orders whenever they believe their assessment of threats supersedes official policy. Anne's defense attorney rose to respond. "General Webb, Colonel Santos presents a narrow interpretation that ignores the extraordinary nature of the threat Captain Angeles identified. The evidence shows that she first attempted to work within the system, providing her analysis to appropriate intelligence personnel. Only when official channels proved inadequate did she take emergency action." Colonel Mitchell activated his own display showing Anne's meteorological analysis and intelligence reports. Furthermore, Captain Angeles' actions provided critical intelligence regarding Chinese nuclear capabilities that has enhanced American strategic planning. Her mission was not only successful in preventing immediate conflict, but also contributed to long-term national security. General Webb studied the evidence presentations with the careful attention of someone who understood that her decision would be analyzed by military historians for decades. "Colonel Mitchell, the tribunal acknowledges the intelligence value of Captain Angeles' mission. However, the question before us is whether the military can function effectively if individual officers are permitted to override command authority based on their personal assessment of emergency situations." The hearing continued for 3 hours as witnesses testified regarding Anne's character, her technical competence, and the strategic implications of her actions. Admiral Chen Wei participated via secure video link from Beijing, providing testimony that carried significant diplomatic weight. "General Webb," Admiral Chen said, "Captain Angeles demonstrated exceptional professionalism during our negotiations. Her actions reflected not individual rebellion against authority, but rather dedicated service to both her nation and international peace. China's government hopes that America will recognize her contribution to preventing catastrophic conflict." The testimony from Chinese leadership created additional complexity for the tribunal. Punishing Anne too severely could damage the diplomatic relationship she had helped establish, while treating her too leniently could encourage future unauthorized actions by military personnel. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez testified about Anne's intelligence analysis and the institutional failures that had prevented proper recognition of the Chinese threat. General Webb, Captain Angeles identified a strategic threat weeks before it appeared on official intelligence assessments. Her analysis demonstrated exactly the kind of initiative and analytical capability we want in our officers. Technical Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, who had facilitated Anne's access to the B-2, also testified. "General Webb, Captain Angeles told me she was conducting emergency operations to prevent loss of civilian life. I believed her because she had always demonstrated absolute integrity during our previous working relationship." As the day concluded, General Webb announced that the tribunal would deliberate overnight before reaching its verdict. Anne spent that evening in her quarters, uncertain whether she would wake up as a free officer or a convicted criminal. The next morning, Anne returned to the courtroom to face judgment. General Webb's expression revealed nothing as she prepared to announce the tribunal's decision. "Captain Angeles, this tribunal has reached its findings regarding the charges against you. On the charge of theft of military property, we find you guilty. On the charge of unauthorized operation of classified aircraft, we find you guilty. On the charge of violation of international protocols, we find you guilty." Anne felt her heart sink as the guilty verdicts were announced. Despite everything she had accomplished, the military justice system was holding her accountable for her methods regardless of their results. However, General Webb continued, This tribunal also finds that your actions were taken in good faith response to extraordinary circumstances that presented imminent threat to national security. Therefore, while we cannot excuse the violations of military protocol, we recommend clemency based on the exceptional nature of your service. Anne's defense attorney squeezed her shoulder as General Webb announced the sentence. Captain Angelus, you are hereby sentenced to reduction in rank to first lieutenant, forfeiture of 6 months' pay, and restriction to base for 1 year. However, you will retain your commission and your security clearance. And you are hereby assigned to the newly created Pacific Strategic Communication Division, where you will develop protocols for preventing future military misunderstandings between nuclear powers. Anne felt tears streaming down her face as she realized the implications of the sentence. She would face punishment for her violations, but she would also be given the opportunity to continue serving in a role that utilized exactly the skills she had demonstrated during the crisis. Furthermore, General Webb announced, Captain Angelus is awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for extraordinary heroism in preventing nuclear conflict through diplomatic initiative under extreme personal risk. The courtroom erupted in applause from the diplomatic observers and military personnel who had gathered to witness the verdict. Anne stood at attention, overwhelmed by the realization that her country had found a way to hold her accountable while recognizing her service. After the formal proceedings concluded, General Webb approached Anne privately. Lieutenant Angelus, your case has been one of the most challenging I've reviewed in 30 years of military service. You violated important principles of military discipline. But you also demonstrated exactly the kind of initiative and moral courage we need in our officers. Webb handed Anne new assignment orders. Your new position will involve working directly with international partners to establish communication protocols that prevent the kind of misunderstandings that nearly triggered nuclear war. It's important work, and you're uniquely qualified to perform it. Anne accepted the orders with gratitude and humility. General Webb, thank you for recognizing that sometimes serving the military's mission requires challenging its methods. Webb smiled slightly. Lieutenant Angelus, the military's greatest strength has always been our ability to learn and adapt. Your actions have taught us important lessons about individual initiative, strategic communication, and the importance of listening to officers who see threats others might miss. 6 months later, First Lieutenant Anne Angelus sat in her office at the Pacific Strategic Communication Division, reviewing intelligence reports and developing diplomatic protocols that would prevent future nuclear crises. Her unauthorized mission had cost her rank and pay, but it had also given her a new purpose and the respect of colleagues who understood the courage required to risk everything for peace. The stolen B-2 had been quietly returned to service, but not before being thoroughly analyzed by Chinese and American technicians working together under the transparency agreements Anne had helped establish. The joint intelligence cooperation that emerged from her crisis had created new levels of trust between former adversaries. On her desk sat 2 items that reminded her daily of the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this position: a photograph of the B-2 Spirit taken during her unauthorized flight to China, and a letter from Admiral Chen Wei expressing China's gratitude for her role in preventing global catastrophe. Anne Angelus had lost her rank, her reputation, and her dreams of flying the world's most advanced aircraft, but she had gained something more valuable: the knowledge that when civilization itself was at stake, she had chosen to save it rather than save herself. Sometimes, she reflected, the greatest victories required the greatest sacrifices, and sometimes, breaking the rules was the only way to serve them. The woman who had been banned from flying had stolen a bomber to prevent World War III, and in doing so had found her true calling as a guardian of global peace. Her story would be remembered not as the tale of a rogue pilot, but as the moment when one person's courage prevented the end of the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.